it could be peanuts, it could be soy, it could be fish, shellfish. And so each of those are like 1 or less than 1.5% maybe at most in terms of peanuts, probably one of the most popular ones, milk too. Um, Allergens themselves have played a really prominent role in a lot of activity related to food safety. When you think of food safety, it's one of the most common features that consumers have in mind. Um, Often for people in the industry, mislabeling is an issue. It could be a product, there's an accidental cross-contamination related to allergens. They're ongoing concerns, and they make up a large share of the recall alerts here in this country, in Canada, by the CFIA. Um, there are also chemical considerations. It could be biological. It could be the composition of the food. Either they're added to the food or that they've changed the food's composition. And we have experts here who will tell you much more about it. So we're going to look at different hazards. I've seen the agenda. Really, I'll let them introduce you. There are 2 parts with a break in the middle. So you may hear about safety through pre-market approvals. The food safety itself looks at appropriate uses, appropriate limits of various elements in foods, chemicals, ingredients. There may be eventually environmental measures or food handling or preparation practices that affect food that can reduce the risk, but can all add new residues prior to consumption. So those pre-market approval systems in Canada, really, really interesting, a strong model for the rest of the world, I find. And it affects anything from traditional foods, novel foods, could be even fibers, could be additives, infant formulas. And so the range is huge. And I'm excited to hear about all of this from our colleagues, from our partners. And I'd like to pass it over to Marie-Pierre Mignot, our main partner at the CFIA, to give a few opening remarks.
Gracias, Jean-Charles, por estas palabras de bienvenidas.
Thank you very much, Jean-Charles, for these welcoming remarks. Good morning to all and welcome to this workshop on the Canadian Food Allergen CFIA agency. My name is Marie-Pierre Mignot, and I'm the Deputy Director of the International Affairs Branch on the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. My group is in charge of coordinating technical assistance activities within the CFIA mandate. That would be food safety and plant safety. Our technical specialist of CFIA of the Canadian Embassy in Mexico, Natalia Melishenko, is going to be speaking about the regulatory requirements for the allergen control in Canada. And also we have a guest from the Ministry of Health, Mr. Michael Abbott, who is going to be talking about allergens, but from the perspective for protecting consumers in Canada. I really appreciate the collaborative work between ICA Canada and CFIA, which led to this workshop to be transmitted today. I hope that the information that we're about to share with you facilitates your capabilities to guarantee that the products that are produced in your country and exported to Canada are fully compliant with the Canadian import requirements. There is also going to be a Q&A session at the end of the presentations, and I invite you to please write your questions in the chat or in the Q&A section down here so that we can cover them at the end. Also, if you would like to ask a question live to our speakers, you may click on the little hand so that we can deactivate the mute in your mic. I hope that you can find this session useful. And without further ado, I would like to pass the microphone to Michael Abbott. Michael is the head of the Allergy and Food Intelligence section of the Ministry of Health. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and talk to you today about a subject that I've spent a lot of time working on, which is food allergen labeling. So I'll give you a little bit of background information for myself, and then I think mostly what I'm going to talk about is to give you a little bit of history of the food allergies in Canada and the reasoning behind the labeling regulations that we have in place today. So for me, I've been working at Health Canada now for over 25 years in the area of food allergies and food allergens. I spent many years working at Health Canada in our laboratories on analytical methods for the detection of food allergens, specifically food allergen proteins in other foods. We developed and optimized methods for the detection of peanuts, eggs, milk, and some tree nuts. Then in 2008, I moved from the laboratory to start working on health risk assessments and labeling regulations. So when we work on the regulations, we're talking about regulations, but also policies and guidelines, everything having to do with making sure that allergens are labeled appropriately on foods. And I should say right off the top that in the area of food allergies, Health Canada works very closely with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. We'll talk about that throughout the presentation. And just to clarify, I was part of the team that worked on the development of Canada's enhanced allergen labeling regulations. And I continue to work on health risk assessments and labeling regulations, policies, and guidelines anywhere that allergens or gluten labeling is involved. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the history of food allergies in Canada. And I think Canada was one of the first countries where food allergies started to receive a lot of attention. And this goes back to the early 1990s. And at that time, there were a number of consumer groups that organized and advocated for changes that would help to make the lives, in particular, of allergic children and their families better. So many of the people in these groups were mothers of allergic children. In my work, I've met many mothers and fathers of children with allergies, and unfortunately, even a few parents who have lost children to allergic reactions. So that always reinforces the importance of the work that we're doing. You can understand that these were very highly motivated people and personally affected by food allergies. So they worked very hard to make sure that the changes they were looking for would take place. So again, Health Canada has worked with various food allergy consumer groups over the years on a number of different issues, but the biggest of which was to try to improve labeling, in particular labeling of prepackaged foods, to make sure that consumers with food allergies always have the information that they need to be able to make good choices about which foods to eat. So even before these enhanced allergen labeling regulations were developed, Canada already had regulations that required a list of ingredients to appear on the label of most prepackaged foods. However, there were some exemptions in the regulations, which meant that there were some situations where it could be difficult or even impossible for consumers with food allergies to know whether a particular food was safe for them to eat. And so some examples of these exemptions were what we would call multi-component ingredients. So some ingredients that didn't have to declare all of their subcomponents. And in some cases, those subcomponents could be allergens. There were also some ingredients that were derived from allergens where the common name of the ingredient didn't clearly identify that source. So examples of that are things like casein or ovalbumin, which are proteins, specific proteins from milk or eggs. And the other exemption that we wanted to look at was what we would call a third generation ingredient. So that's an ingredient of an ingredient of an ingredient. And in our regulations, there were exemptions where those things didn't have to be declared. So the enhanced labeling regulations were developed with the intent of making sure that whenever food allergens or gluten sources or added sulfites were present as part of the formulation of a prepackaged food, so when they were intentionally added ingredients, that the common name of the food allergen or gluten source would always appear on the label. And we wanted that to make sure that consumers had, again, the information that they would need to be able to make an informed choice. We also wanted to standardize the use of a contains statement to warn about the presence of allergens. So at the time that these regulations were being developed, there were already some companies using contains type statements on food labels, but there was no consistency in how these were being used, and that had the potential to create confusion for consumers. So we wanted to address that. The regulations were developed over a number of years. In fact, this work was already underway in 2008 when I started working on this file. And the initial draft version of the regulations was first published in July of 2008, but a final version wasn't completed until 2011. And the actual labeling regulations first came into force the following year in August of 2012. So during the development of the regulations, when the first draft was published in 2008, we received a number of comments from the public, from the food industry, and from other interested parties on various aspects of the regulations. This is part of the process in Canada when new regulations are being developed. There's always a chance provided to the public and other stakeholders to provide input. And based on the comments that were received, some aspects of the regulations were updated and refined prior to the regulations being finalized. So, and one of the things I wanted to address is how Canada chose our list of allergens that are included in the regulations. And these are often referred to as the priority food allergens for Canada. The initial list came from a specific scientific publication in Canada from the Canadian Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology that came out in 1999. And in fact, this publication was the main starting point for the development of our enhanced labeling regulations. The list in this publication included almost all of the allergens that ended up in our final regulations, except for mustard. So this publication talked about peanuts, tree nuts, specifically almonds, Brazil nuts, cashews, hazelnuts, macadamia nuts, pecans, pine nuts, pistachios, and walnuts, as well as sesame seeds, milk, eggs, fish, crustacea like crabs or lobster, molluscan shellfish such as clams or oysters, as well as soy, wheat, and sulfites. So these were all identified as being foods that were commonly associated with allergic reactions, and in particular with severe allergic reactions in Canada. When that first draft of Canada's labeling regulations was published, it included that list that I just spoke about. And in the comments that we received from the public, there were a significant number asking us to consider other allergens, in particular mustard and onions and garlic were also mentioned. So at that point, we realized we had to develop some criteria to assess which foods belonged on our list of priority allergens. And this led to the development of the Canadian criteria for the establishment of new priority food allergens. And what we look for in these criteria are things like the existence of a credible cause-effect relationship. So this is scientific data, scientific information, preferably based on double-blind placebo-controlled food challenge studies. So these are particular studies where people are challenged with foods to see if they will have an allergic reaction. We also looked for other types of reports of severe allergic reactions following exposure to particular foods. And we looked at data about the prevalence or how common those particular allergies were in the Canadian population. And we also considered things like the potency or the allergenic potency of the food, meaning whether or not the food was able to provoke allergic reactions even when very small amounts were consumed, and the potential for Canadian exposure to a particular food or ingredient. And finally, we looked at whether or not the food or ingredient might be a hidden component under our existing labeling regulations. So under those exemptions that I was speaking about earlier. After reviewing all of the information that was available, it was decided that mustard would be included on the list of priority allergens in Canada. But based again on our analysis at that time, onions and garlic were not included on the Canadian priority list. I should mention that there is more details about the analysis that was done, as well as the criteria for the establishment of new priority allergens. This information is available on the Government of Canada website. So another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about while we're discussing the Canadian list of priority allergens is how this compares to priority lists in other countries. So for example, the Codex list, so a lot of people are familiar with Codex, the FAO WHO body that works on all different aspects of food and food safety. But Codex did some work years ago on food allergens, and they developed a particular list that includes cereals containing gluten, as well as crustacea and products of these, eggs and egg products, fish and fish products, peanuts and soybeans and their products, milk and milk products, tree nuts and nut products, and sulfites. So this is a list that many people may be familiar with. It's sometimes referred to as the Big Eight, and it's a list that many countries will use or will sort of base their priority lists on, maybe modify it slightly. In Europe, they actually, in the EU, they have a number of additional allergens on their list. So they also consider celery and products of celery, mustard and products thereof, sesame seeds and products thereof, lupin and products thereof, and mollusks and products thereof. So you can see the EU has a fairly extensive list. And it's in addition to those Codex ones that were mentioned. So if you look at these different lists, you'd see that Canada's list of priority allergens is similar to, but not exactly the same as the list of allergens in the US or the EU. For example, the US doesn't include mustard or molluscan shellfish on their list, where Canada does. And sesame was only recently added to the US list, I think within the last year or two. On the other hand, the US does include some tree nuts that are not on the Canadian list. So for example, coconut and shea nut and chestnut are part of the US list, but aren't considered on the Canadian list. And the European Union includes all of the Canadian priority allergens, as well as celery and lupin, which are not on the Canadian list. So I guess the main thing to understand here is that different countries do have different lists of priority allergens, and it's important to know exactly which ones you have to be aware of when you're labeling and exporting to different countries. Another important aspect, I guess, just before I move on to the next topic, is that some countries, like in the EU, they talk about allergens and products thereof. So they identify basically anything that has been derived from that allergen. Whereas in Canada and in the US, the labeling regulations are specific to the presence of protein from a priority allergen. We know that it's protein that triggers allergic reactions in consumers with food allergies. So in the case of Canada and the US, if a particular ingredient is derived from a food allergen source, but it's been highly refined and the protein portion has been removed, then you don't have to treat that ingredient as an allergen as far as labeling in Canada or the US. So I actually did a quick search online to see what the list of priority allergens would look like in some of the various IICA countries. And from what I could tell, it appeared that a lot of those countries followed the Codex list, or fairly similar to the Codex list. Sometimes it was modified slightly, but it appears that the Codex list was one that most were following. So another aspect I wanted to talk a little bit about was health risk assessments, or how we go about assessing the health risk when there are incidents of undeclared or improperly declared allergens in foods. And I mentioned earlier, Health Canada works very closely with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency in the area of food allergens. Health Canada is responsible for developing health and safety related labeling regulations, like our allergen labeling regulations. And the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is responsible for enforcing these regulations. So when there are incidents of undeclared or improperly declared allergens in foods, CFIA is responsible for investigating and gathering information, working directly with manufacturers or importers. And once this information is obtained, then Health Canada will analyze the information and develop a health risk assessment. So the level of risk posed by the product is then used by CFIA to help decide what actions are required to mitigate the risk to consumers. And CFIA works with manufacturers or importers to carry out whatever corrective actions are required, which can include recall of products that are considered dangerous. So in terms of the health risk assessment, one of the things that we look at is the amount of allergen that's present in the food. And this brings up the question of thresholds for allergens. Canada does not have any regulatory threshold levels for allergens. So this means that there's no specific allowable level for undeclared allergens in prepackaged foods. There are a number of reasons for this. For example, we know that individuals with food allergies can react at very different levels. So that means some people with food allergies are much more sensitive than other people are. And we also know that even an individual's threshold level can vary over time. So the same person might react to more or less allergen on a particular day or under particular circumstances. And this is one of our challenges in the area of food allergens. It makes it very difficult to say what a safe level of allergen in a food might be. We do have some data available from food challenge studies, which shows what level had triggered allergic reactions in people that participated in those studies. And we can look at that to get an idea of what the lowest level is that some people reacted to in the past. And we use this information to help with our health risk assessments and to know how dangerous a particular level is going to be. So one takeaway would be that even though we can't set specific threshold levels for allergens, we do know that the most sensitive individuals can react to very small amounts. So for a lot of our priority allergens, the most sensitive individuals can react to less than 1 milligram of protein, which is, again, a very small amount. So people can be very sensitive to these. We do have sensitive analytical test methods available for most of the priority allergens that can detect in the low part per million range. And these are used as part of ongoing monitoring and surveillance and compliance activities by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So we are able to test foods and find low levels of allergens in them. Just getting near the end of the presentation, I did want to mention a couple of new or emerging issues that we're seeing now in the area of food allergens. And this is the fact that there are some foods that are not on Canada's list of priority allergens, but that can still trigger allergic reactions in some people. And some of these are on other countries' lists of priority allergens, but some are foods that are closely related to one of our priority allergens. And I'll just spend a minute or two talking about those. So one example is lupin. And lupin is a legume like peanuts or peas or beans. It's not commonly used in foods in Canada, but is more commonly used in some European countries. And the issue for lupin is that some people with peanut allergy will also react if they consume lupin. So as I said, the use of lupin in foods isn't very common in Canada, but there were a couple of adverse reactions reported a few years ago to foods that contained lupin, and that was in consumers with peanut allergy. So the product that triggered the reactions was appropriately labeled. It did have lupin listed as an ingredient, but the consumers that ate it, they weren't aware that if they had peanut allergy, they might also react to lupin. So that was something that we tried to address by developing some information for consumers to advise them that if they had peanut allergy, they might also react to lupin. Another issue which is similar and is something that we're seeing more in Canada is the use of insects as protein sources for human food. This is a growing area of interest, and while there's not a lot of products on the market yet in Canada, this has the potential to be an issue for consumers with crustacean allergy. So consumers that are allergic to crustaceans like lobster and crab may also have reactions if they eat some of these edible insect products. And again, this was an issue where we wanted to alert consumers and make sure they were aware of this. It's also an issue where some of the products that are being marketed with insects as ingredients are putting a warning label on or a warning statement on their label to warn consumers with crustacean allergy about that possible cross reactivity. So just in conclusion, I guess I wanted to give you, like I say, a bit of history of allergies in Canada, and in particular, our enhanced labeling regulations. I think I might have mentioned they first came into force in 2012. So that's over 10 years ago now. We don't have any or I should say, we are not currently considering adding any foods to the Canadian list of priority allergens, but this could always change in the future if there was strong evidence to support the addition of a new food allergen to the list. So our labeling regulations, we don't have any particular amendments or new regulations under development. Natalie is going to be going through in much more detail the specifics of our allergen labeling regulations afterwards. But one thing to keep in mind is that our main goal with regards to allergen labeling is working to make sure that allergic consumers in Canada, or whoever is buying food for them, have the information that they need from the information that's provided on the food label to make informed choices about which foods are safe for them to eat and which foods they need to avoid, so that they can keep themselves safe from allergic reactions. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Michael, por esta presentación.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your very interesting presentation. And now we continue with today's agenda. We will be hearing about the application of the regulations on food allergens in Canada by Ms. Natalia Melichenko, who is a specialist at the CFIA in Mexico. And also, according to the agenda, we will have a brief break after module 1. So, Natalia, you have the floor.
Let me share my screen. Good morning, bonjour, buen día a todas y todos. Great to see such a numerous audience. Thank you, Michael, for doing this great introduction to the allergen labeling. So let me start with the objectives of today's webinar, like specifically of this module 1 and 2. My main objective is to present you the information that will help you to understand Canada's approach and regulations to allergens. In particular, in this presentation, you will see overview of the Canadian regulations for the labeling of allergen, the principles of preventative control activities, where to go to find Canadian reference documents and regulations, and key resources and links that you should keep in your toolbox for future reference. Okay, just a second. So for module 1, we will be able to identify the list of ingredients on a label, identify an ingredient and a component, outline allergen labeling requirements using the industry labeling tool, and properly declare allergens in the list of ingredients. Let's have a quick look at the food allergy situation in Canada and talk a little bit what is a food allergy. Michael already touched base a little bit about what's going in Canada in terms of that. Here you see a few numbers. Which unfortunately you can see the increase in mostly in kids, the increase of people affected by different allergies in Canada. Food allergy represents an important food safety issue because of the potential lethal effects. And the only effective way, the treatment to avoid this kind of reason for sickness or lethal effects is to completely remove an allergens from the diet. However, due to growing complexity of food formulations and food processing, foods may be unintentionally contaminated via allergen-containing ingredients or cross-contamination. All this leads to increase of Canadian population allergic to certain foods, especially in kids. Food allergies are sensitivities caused by a reaction of the body's immune system to specific proteins in food. In allergic individuals, a food protein is mistakenly identified by the immune system as being harmful. And when a person is exposed to such a protein, the body's immune system responds by creating antibodies called immunoglobulin E. When this person is exposed again to the same food protein, antibodies and chemicals such as histamine are released. Histamine is a very powerful chemical that can cause a reaction to the respiratory system, gastrointestinal tract, skin, or cardiovascular system. In the most extreme cases, food allergies can be fatal. So practically any food can provoke an immune response in an allergic individuals. But as Michael mentioned, there are a few foods that are responsible for the majority of food allergens. So allergic, just a second. Allergens. Allergic consumers must avoid consuming a food product that contain the allergen, but how do we know that the allergen is in this food? And they rely about this on the labeling. So these are the priority allergens that you can see on the slide. In Canada, these are different tree nuts, sesame seeds, just a second, I'll just aligning my presentation a bit. That would be mollusca, soy, milk, eggs, and etc. Canada has regulations in place for declaring those allergens, as well as gluten sources and sulfites. And together, all these requirements are called labeling requirements. Health Canada, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, allergy associations, and the medical community have identified the key substances most frequently associated with allergens and allergic reactions. Priority allergens are required to be identified as such, but they are common names, so they are recognized by the consumers. There are other ingredients in foods that cause similar reactions. That is why, besides the priority allergens, these are additional requirements to declare sources of gluten and sulfites, when sulfites are present at 10 particles per million or more. So whenever we will be talking of declaring sulfites, it means that the quantity in food is 10 particles per million or more. All this information you can find later in the fact sheets and the web resources, which will be presented in the second module. Sources of allergen, gluten, and sulfites can appear within the list of ingredients, in parentheses, beside or in common name of the ingredient or component, and in a separate statement that includes food allergen source, gluten source, and added sulfites, which is referred to as contains heading. So throughout the presentation, we will be referring to that statement as a contains statement. It is voluntarily to use a separate contains statement. However, if a contains statement is used, it must be complete, which means that the statement has to include all the allergens in the product, even if some, or in case of this example, are already declared in the list of ingredients. Like you can see like milk, and you can see repeated in contain statement milk. Sources of allergen, gluten, and added sulfites must be declared using their prescribed names. But how do we declare glutens? How they have to be made? So for gluten from barley, oats, rice, triticale, which is a combination of wheat and rye, wheat or hybridized stains, we have to declare them as the name of the cereal itself. And how do we name sulfites in the label? By their common names, sulfites or sulfiding agents. Or we can declare them by any of the allowed chemical names in the Food and Drug Regulations. However, if the chemical name is used, the prescribed source, the name should be following in the parentheses, so consumers can recognize it. On this slide, we can see how to declare allergens in the list of ingredients in more details. Sources of allergen, gluten, sulfites can appear, as we said, within the list of ingredients. And we can see that they follow, the common name follow the ingredient. Like for example, here we can see. And also source of allergens, gluten, and added sulfites must be declared by prescribed names. It's a bit difficult to see the slide in Spanish, but if you can see here, like we have here flour, and then we have wheat, which is recognized as an allergen in the parentheses, the same like liquid albumin, and we have egg in parentheses, the same as milk. Sources of allergen, gluten, and added sulfites must be declared, again, these prescribed names. And then we have a precautionary statements. That would be, just a second. We don't have it on the slide, but sometimes we have a precautionary statements, like here. Here we have it. Puede contener nueces pecan. May contains pecans. We will go over this precautionary statement a bit later. And I would like to mention that there are also legibility requirements that we will discuss in the course of this presentation a bit later. Allergen labeling regulations are one part of the food labeling rules in Canada. This slide presents an overview of the various Canadian requirements related to labeling that you can access on the CFIA Industry Labeling Tool website. So these are core labeling requirements. Most prepackaged foods sold in Canada are required to be labeled with common name, date making in storage if the shelf life is 90 days or less, a dealer name and place of business, list of ingredients and allergens, net quantity, and nutrition facts table. And this information must be legible and in both official languages, English and French. All information and presentations on food labels must be truthful and not misleading. And in addition, there may be commodity-specific requirements. For example, certain commodities require country of origin labeling. Let's go have a List of ingredients. What's the definition? What's exactly should be on a list of ingredients? That's in ingredients and components, which are ingredients of ingredients. It must be declared by their common name and in the descending order of proportion by weight in this product. In this example, all food allergens, gluten sources, and added sulfites are declared at least once in the contains statement, even though, for example, potassium bisulfite has already appeared in ingredient list. Since the contains statement is being used to declare other known allergen sources like milk, sesame, and wheat, sulfites must appear in both places. What kind of food needs an ingredient list? An accurate list of ingredients is important to all consumers. So we need to understand what kind of food requires and what needs and what not. Most prepackaged foods with more than one ingredient must declare a list of ingredients in their components unless components are exempt. In a single ingredient food, the common name serves as the list of ingredient. Certain foods have an exemption from carrying a list of ingredients. And can you think of foods that do not require a list of ingredients? Some of them do not, so we will look at this later in the slides. Prepackaged vinegars. So this is the list of most of the foods that do not require a list of ingredients, like packaged from bulk of the retail premises, portion packs served by restaurants with meals, and barbecues boiled on retail premises. But I would like to stop on the last one, prepackaged vinegars subject to compositional standards in the FDR regulations. They are exempt from declaring a list of ingredients if they are standardized, such as wine vinegar, white vinegar, malt vinegar, cider vinegar, blended vinegar. However, even allergen, if labeling is still required, for example, added sulfites present a higher number than in the norm, and if the risk of unavoidable cross-contamination, precautionary labeling must be used, such as main contain sulfites. On the other hand, unstandardized vinegars products, such as flavored vinegars, are not exempt from the list of ingredients and require a complete list of ingredients. For example, if we take raspberry vinegar, it should declare that it has wine vinegar, sugar, raspberry puree, and sulfites. Let's have a look now how an ingredient is defined in the Canadian labeling regulation and what is happening when an ingredient consists of other ingredients. So the definition of ingredient means an individual unit of food that is combined as an individual unit of food with one or more individual units of food to form an integral unit of food that is sold as prepackaged product. It's a little bit complicated. When an ingredient is composed of other ingredients, those ones are called components. Currently, the Food and Drug Regulations require the declarations up to component level or ingredient of ingredient. And to begin, think of the flour as we've shown in the slide. This can be sold as a food itself or be an ingredient of a pizza. For allergen and gluten sources, a declaration is required through multi-generation as long as the proteins are present in the food. In the case of added sulfides, declaration is required when it's present at, as I said, 10 ppm or more particles per million. Over the next few slides, we will be looking at what would constitute a first generation and a second generation of the ingredients. So if we look at pizza, so it consists of different ingredients like flour, mozzarella cheese, tomato sauce, pepperoni, water, salt, herbs, and yeast. These are all ingredients, right? And now if we look in more details of components of these ingredients, the list becomes much longer. For example, let's look at pepperoni. It has pork, sodium nitrite, dextrose, salt, spices, and bacterial culture. So what generations are components of ingredients that you can see in red on that list? And the answer is their second generation. Just a sec, this is 2. So when you look at pizza and the pepperoni ingredient, a list of ingredients, including component of ingredients, if there are any, is required to be shown on a label of most prepackaged foods. Components are ingredients of the ingredients, as I said. So sometimes we speak of the first, second, third, even fourth generation. It means that an ingredient is the first generation. An ingredient of an ingredient is the second. An ingredient of a component is the third generation. So look, if we look at this pizza example, this pizza contains the ingredient pepperoni. Spices are a component of the pepperoni and is considered to be a second generation ingredient. Mustard, which is present in spices, is considered to be a third generation ingredient. And as you saw earlier in the presentation, mustard is considered to be a priority allergen in Canada. So in this example, mustard should be declared in the list of ingredients, or if there is a contain statement, in the contain statement. Have a look at another example, for example, where we don't have to declare. Let's think of coconut cookie chunks in the ice cream. The coconut contains butylated hydroxylanosyl. It's a preservative that prevents rancidity in foods. In the ice cream, the coconut cookies are in the ingredient, so like first generation. The coconut is the component of the cookies, second generation. BHA is a component of the coconut, therefore it is an ingredient of a component within the ice cream, third generation. But BHA is not an allergen, so it does not have to be declared. The sources of food allergen and gluten must be declared whenever the proteins, modified proteins, or protein fractions are present in the prepackaged food, even if they are beyond the second generation. In the case of added sulfides, they must be declared when they are present at level of 10 ppm or more. there are some exemptions from being declared in ingredient of components. For example, wax coating compounds in their components are not required to be shown on the labels of a prepackaged fresh fruit or fresh vegetables as an ingredient or component. Like sometimes we see apples, turnips, and cucumbers are example of waxed produce. Same goes for sausage casing. Sausage casing are not required to be shown on the label of prepackaged sausages as an ingredient or component. However, the allergen labeling requirements mandate the declaration of any food allergen, gluten source, or sulfites present in the wax coating compounds or sausage casing. The non-allergen components are still exempt from the declaration. Here is an example of foods exempt from component declaration. These foods normally carry a complete list of ingredients, including components, if any, when they are sold at the grocery store as a prepackaged product. However, when these same foods are used as ingredients in the manufacture of other foods, with few exceptions, they are exempt from component listing. They include margarine, butter, standardized breads, etc. However, any food allergen, gluten source, or sulfites when 10 ppm or more present in the ingredient or multi-generational sub-ingredients, they must be declared. This information may be declared in brackets immediately after the ingredient name in the list of ingredients or in a contained statement. There are other exemptions, and these are preparations of mixtures exempt from component declaration. These slides present those examples. These products must list any components of an ingredient that are food allergens, gluten sources, or sulfites. For example, a prepackaged food contains an ingredient spices. That food will be required to list any allergens, for example, mustard in the spices, as a component. For example, when salt is an ingredient or component of one of the mentioned preparation or mixtures shown in the previous slide, it must be declared in the list of ingredients as if it was added directly to an ingredient. It is not declared as a component of one of the preparations of mixtures. This requirement pertains only to the ingredient listed on the slide, which are ingredients or components of one of the mentioned preparations of mixtures from the previous slide. The final entry of the above list requires any ingredients or components that perform a function in or has any effect on that food to be shown by its common name in the list of ingredients or of the food to which it is added, as it is a direct ingredient of the food. Okay, it's very complicated, so let's look at the example. Let's, for example, have a lemon flavor preparation that has a yellow color added to it to color the flour preparation, the flavor preparation, which also turns a cake to which it is added to be yellow. So the color is then considered to have an effect on the food, and the color must be declared. Now we have a question to you. Peanut oil, hydrogenated peanut oil, and modified peanut oil must always be declared even if if it is contained in any ingredient exempted from declaring components. Would it be true or false? And the answer is, of course, true. FDR, Food Drug Regulation, requires that the above components contained in any ingredients exempted from the declaring components always be shown on the list of ingredients. This section of FDR applies to those ingredients listed that those preparations and mixtures described in previous slide, as discussed previously. This is in addition to the requirements in the allergen regulations that any protein or protein fraction of food allergen, such as peanuts, present in the food at any level will have to be declared by its source name defined in the regulations. Let's have, as you can see on this slide, food additives are defined in the Food and Drug Regulations as any substance that the use of which results or may reasonably be expected to result in it or its byproducts becoming a part of affecting the characteristics of the food. Some examples of food additives include calcium silicate, which is an anti-caking agent, or carotene, which is a coloring agent, or isomate, which is a sweetener. If a food additive is the source of allergen, so allergen labeling will be required. For example, lysozyme from egg is a food additive. Lysozyme from egg whites will follow the same labeling requirements for common name that are set out in the Food and Drug Regulations or other applicable legislation. Lysozyme is type of protein from egg and is therefore subject to be labeling requirements of food allergens. So that's going to be lysozyme, and in the brackets we will see egg. Food additives must be called by the acceptable common name, and the correct common name can be found on Health Canada website under the 15 lists of permitted food additives. Some of the additives have permitted synonyms that can be found on the CFIA industry labeling tool food additives page under permitted synonyms for food additives table. So all the links will be at the end of the presentation. Don't worry about that. Now we will be discussing into flavor enhancers. We will just briefly speak about the manner of declaration of flavor enhancers. This has already been mentioned in the previous slides with components that must always be declared. Flavor enhancers are considered to have an effect on the final food and therefore must be declared by name in the list of ingredients as if they were added directly to the food. For flavor enhancers such as hydrolyzed vegetable protein and monosodium glutamate, like we know they're usually abbreviation HVP or MSG, they're not acceptable to be used in the ingredient list. However, they're acceptable when used in other areas of the label. For example, such claims as no MSG added. In addition, if the plant source is soy, it must be declared as an allergen. Previously, I have already mentioned the term common name. The definition applies to common names of ingredients and components. This is either the name prescribed in regulation for example, the name of a standardized food such as milk or bread, or the name by which it is commonly known, like, for example, vanilla cookies. Common names can be a way to declare allergen, like milk. And usually they are seen on the principal display panel, which is like the part of the food label that is most likely to be displayed to the consumer when for sale on the shelf. Common name of allergen, common name of an ingredient or component. Common name of an ingredient or component is required to be used in ingredient list. Common names are defined as the names of ingredient or component that is required to be used in this ingredient list. If a common name is printed in boldface type in the Food and Drug Regulations, this name is the only acceptable common name for this food. If this is not the case, if it's not in bold, alternative names that meet the definition of common name are permitted. Go further. Food and Drug Regulations make provisions for the use of optional common names of ingredients and components. For example, when we have an optional name, it should look like protein, like for example, it's a plant protein product. So we have the name of the plant plus protein product. Like hydrolyzed plant protein, we have hydrolyzed plus the name of the plant plus protein of hydrolyzed plus the name of the plant of this protein. So it's a little bit complicated, but you have the names of the common names and optional common names in the table on the CFIA website, and the link will be provided further. Okay. There are like Food and Drug Regulations also make provisions for the use of collective names. Collective names may be used if they can reduce a space in the list of ingredients or prepackaged foods labeling. Premium ingredients may only appear specifically named when all the other ingredients are also specifically named. Recognizing milk as an allergen is critical. Milk ingredients can appear in so many foods with so many names. One example of a collective common name is milk ingredients. So milk ingredients include those components of milk that have not their chemical composition altered and that exist in the food in the same chemical state in which they are normally found in milk. Okay, and now we can look at another manner of declaring, which is modified milk ingredient. So modified milk ingredients, on the other hand, include components of milk which have their chemical state altered from that what was normally would be found in the milk. Include any of the following in liquid, concentrated, dry, frozen, or reconstructed form, namely like calcium, reduced skim milk, casein nuts, whey butter, whey cream, and others. As many of the ingredients in the modified milk ingredients group are of lesser quality than those in the milk ingredients group, when the manufacturer chooses to collectively identify a combination of both milk ingredients and modified milk ingredients, they must be declared as modified milk ingredients. There is some flexibility in ingredient declaration. Sometimes there are shortages in the supply of certain ingredients of natural or economic reasons. So forcing manufacturers to substitute, vary, or omit certain ingredients that are normally used. FDR provides for an ordinary procedure for manufacturers to substitute, vary, or omit ingredients while maintaining a correct ingredient list for consumers. Let's look first at the omissions and substitutions. When ingredients or components are omitted or substituted during a first 12 months period of the foods, that might be used as an ingredient or component through the 12 months period, must be shown in the list of ingredients. It must be clearly stated as part of the list of ingredients that ingredient or component might not be present, or that another ingredient or component might be substituted. The foods that might be omitted or substituted must be grouped with the same class of foods that are normally used as ingredients or components, and the foods within each group must be listed in descending order of the proportion in which they will probably be needed during the 12 months period. When omissions and substitutions happen, list of ingredients may not remain correct, because new ingredients in substitution can be hazards. Every time there is a new ingredient or a new supplier, importers have to redo the analysis as part of preventive controls. We can see it, for example, even in variations section. As example, beef or pork variation in a sausage. When proportions of ingredients or components are varied, the list of ingredients may show the ingredients or components on the label in the same proportions throughout the 12 months period. It is clearly stated as if it is clearly stated as part of the list of ingredients that the proportions indicated are subject to change. Example of beef and pork variations like on this slide. Is it possible that the new supplier uses pork with a spice that contaminates an allergen? As an ingredient substitution, new ingredients in variation can be hazards. That's what I said in the previous slide. So if we have this variation and we've had substitution, we have to check if there are allergens in these ingredients. So how do we indicate omission, substitutions, and variations? The manufacturer may decide how he will indicate in the list of ingredients that an ingredient or component may have been omitted, substituted, or varied. In all cases, the ingredients should appear in descending order of probable proportion and grouped together by class. The class group should then appear at the proper place in the list of ingredients on the finished product. Sometimes we can use the asterisk at the ingredients to indicate that an explanation regarding an omission or substitution or variation appears at the end of the list of ingredients. Those who export to Canada may be aware that amendments were made in FDR with regard to the list ingredients for labeling. And Michael mentioned it in his presentation. So regulated parties have 5-year transition period since 2016. So the transition period is ending on December 14th, 2021 to meet these new requirements. The general list of ingredient requirements remain the same in that most prepackaged foods with more than one ingredient must be declared their ingredients and components in a list of ingredients, and that ingredients are declared in decreasing order or proportion by weight. However, as you can see on this slide, several changes have been made to the list of ingredients with the intention of making it easier to read for consumers. There are also many new eligibility requirements for both the list of ingredients and the contains statements. For example, there is now a minimum type height requirement. The title's ingredients and contains must be bolded. The declaration of ingredients must be in upper and lower case letters. Ingredients are separated by commas or bullets, and components of ingredients must be declared in lowercase letters and separated by commas. You will notice that sugar-based ingredients must now be grouped together. You also note some changes to food colors, which we will address in the next slide. Okay. There are new requirements for how food colors are declared in the list of ingredients. The common name color is no longer permitted, and food colors must be declared by names. Only 2 colors, notably Ponceau SX and Citrus Red No. 2, have specifications in the FDR. For all other food colors without FDR specifications, the additive must meet either its Food Chemical Codex or DEFCA certifications. Lastly, certification by Health Canada is no longer required for synthetic food colors. And that's the end of this very technical presentation. Thank you, everyone, and we will reconvene after the break.
Yes, gracias Natalia. Entonces, ¿cómo se menciona?
Yes, thank you, Natalia. So as mentioned, we are going to take a short 10-minute break. So I propose you to please be back in 10 minutes. That would be 30 past the hour. Please be back in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay.
Creo que podemos empezar de nuevo. Entonces, bienvenidos de regreso a todos y vamos a continuar con el módulo 2 con Natalia. Les quiero también recordar que puedan
And
poner
let's continue with module 2 with Natalia. You can put your questions in the chat. And we're going to take some time at the end for clarifications to try to respond to these questions. So Natalia, please go ahead with module 2.
So let's get back to labeling of allergens. And by the end of the second module, you should be able to describe the import process, roles and responsibility for importers, for Canadian importers and foreign suppliers. Recognize the relevant legislation like Food Drugs Act and its regulations, and Safe Food for Canadians Act and its regulations. You should be able to identify controls that industry can apply to achieve product safety and locate compliance promotion tools and resources. So let's go. Just to provide some context, due to its northern geolocation and cold climate, the variety of food that is grown in Canada is limited. At the same time, the diversity of the population requests familiar food from the original cultures that they came from. And that is why Canada is the 6th largest importer of agriculture and agri-food products in the world. Imports are sourced from over 190 countries, and they may differ, that the countries may have different level of food safety controls, oversight, and standards. Over 200,000 food import transactions worth of $1 billion take place every month in Canada, and these numbers are increasing. Let's have a look at the food import process. Who are the participants and what are their responsibilities in terms of providing the safety of imported food? From the Canadian side, the main participants in this process are importers, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and Canadian Border Services, which is Canadian Customs. Canadian importers are responsible to make sure the food they import is safe and that it meets Canadian requirements. There is a number of requirements, quite a number. So, for example, they have to obtain an import license. They have to verify the food safety controls that foreign suppliers like you would have in place. And they have to notify CBSA and CFIA that a shipment is to be imported and provide all the relevant information and documents, because all food shipments destined for sale in Canada need to be declared to the CFIA and CBSA. Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA, is Canada's food safety competent authority. For countries for which Canada has a recognition arrangement, CFIA is responsible for interaction with those countries' competent authorities to maintain and develop new arrangements. CFA is responsible for conducting audits of food safety control systems of other countries and conducting inspections of foreign establishments. This is usually a requirement for the renewal or maintenance of a recognition arrangement. CFIA is responsible for the assessment of the shipment documentation to verify that those shipments that require certification by the foreign competent authority are accompanied by the adequate certificate and annex or addendums with negotiated statements. When required, the CFIA is responsible for the implementation of temporary import restrictions. For example, a foreign meat establishment may be temporarily suspended after the detection of a critical non-compliance. In the same way, the CFIA will be responsible to lift these restrictions when the issue has been resolved. This slide shows a continuum of activities at border points of entry. Looking at this slide, can you tell me who is responsible to provide a relevant documentation to Canadian Border Services, CFIA or importer? Yes, it's importer's responsibility to provide the CBSA and consequently the CFIA with information about each shipment. To make it easier for exporters, importers, and brokers, CFIA consolidated its food import requirements for the CFIA regulated food in a reference tool called the Automated Import Reference System, AIRS, which is publicly available. And importers should be consulting this system regularly to ensure that her or his broker provides the CFIA with required information and documentation needed for release a shipment into Canadian commerce. And it's very easy to navigate this database if you know the HS code of your product. This slide shows the shared responsibility across the import continuum. The Canadian Border Services Agency, CBSA, is responsible for the initial import inspection of food, agriculture inputs, and agriculture products. CFIA sets the policies and regulations for these imports, which are enforced by CBSA at the Canadian entry points. Exporters and foreign suppliers should work with their Canadian importers to understand the requirements to import into Canada and to identify any Canadian requirements that may be unique from other foreign trading partners. For example, declare all ingredients, including additives, which are used, like sulfites. Labeling should be in English and French. You should know additives that are approved in Canada or Canadian pesticides levels. We cannot stress it too much. Regulated parties are responsible for the safety of their products, including addressing potential risks associated with the presence of allergens, gluten, and sulfites. Under the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, the importer is responsible for ensuring that the foreign supplier is manufacturing, preparing, storing, packaging, or labeling the food before it is imported into Canada under the same conditions that are required in Canada. Foreign suppliers need to be aware of Canadian food safety regulations and also be willing and able to provide Canadian importers with the information those importers need to demonstrate that the food safety controls are in place. Because it is importers' responsibility to verify the foreign suppliers' food safety controls, which may include different aspects. For example, that there is an oversight of the supplier by the foreign competent authority, that there are provisions allowing the request for relevant sampling results, that internal or external audits can be concluded. I'm proud to say that Canada is known to have one of the strongest food systems in the world. In terms of CFIA's legislative authority when it comes to food, CFIA operates under two key acts and their regulations. So Food and Drugs Act and regulations, which support innovation of the sector through a modernized ingredient and nutrition labeling. And the second key legislation is Safe Food for Canadians Act and regulations. This is one of the great advantages to food businesses that the SFCR, which came into the force in January 2019, streamlined requirements to provide a consistent level of safety for all foods imported, exported, and traded interprovincially. The Safe Food for Canadians Act and regulations support ongoing market access for food businesses and increase confidence in food safety. It also aligns with many trading partners moving to preventative and outcome-based approaches for managing risks. When we say outcome-based, there are also sometimes people have questions, what does it mean? So when in many cases, specifically the outcome that regulated parties must be meet without prescribing the way it should be achieved. This is the beauty of SFCR. It doesn't tell the company how they should come to the outcome. However, when necessary, the SFCR uses a mix of outcomes and prescriptive-based requirements. In some cases, prescriptive requirements are used for situations that have a greater risk factor, such as animal slaughter or shellfish harvesting. So by specifying the outcome that a business must meet, rather than describing the way it must be met, businesses are better able to introduce new technologies, processes, and procedures. Now I have a few questions to you. Which legislation covers allergen labeling? Is it FDR or SFCR? And which legislation outlines the traceability requirements? Let's check ourselves in the following slides. So the answer to question 1 is FDR. Here is a snapshot of the elements that are relevant to allergens in the food and drug regulations. Food and drug FDR includes provisions with relations to the following: allergen declaration, precautionary labeling, and language. And we'll go through each of those in more details in the next slides. We already discussed the list of ingredients and contain statement before the break, so we won't go into much details about this. What's important to remember is that sources of allergen, gluten, and sulfites can appear within the list of ingredients and in a separate contain statement. And if the contain statement is used, it must be complete. Now let's look closer at the precautionary labeling of allergen. So Health Canada has recommended the wording may contain for allergen precautionary statements. If there is no risk of cross-contamination, then no statements should be used. Sometimes there is an issue with the overuse of precautionary statements. We sometimes see blanket statements that say may contain and then the list of all priority allergens. So this is not really an acceptable way to label unless there is a real risk that all of those ingredients being present in the food. So the main points to keep in mind for precautionary labeling are: it's a warning statement that this is not a substitute for good manufacturing practices, that they should be used when, despite all reasonable measures, the inadvertent presence of allergens in food is unavoidable. Language labeling. Mandatory information is required in French and English unless otherwise provided for in legislation. So when it is required that allergen labeling must be in English and French, and one of the languages is missing, it's considered that the information is unavailable to the consumer. Here is a snapshot of the elements that are relevant to allergens in the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. The SFCR framework includes requirements pertaining to the prevention of risk in all foods and enabling a faster response in the event of a food safety incident. They're supported by 4 internationally recognized horizontal elements. We have like 3 on the slide, but there are actually 4 of them. And these elements include licensing, outcome-based regulations, preventive control plans, and traceability. So we're going to look at those in more detail now. Even before SFCR came into force, all imported food was required to meet Canadian food safety requirements, but only importers of some foods were required to be licensed and have a preventative control plan. The SFCR introduced a consistent approach across all types of imported foods. And under SFCR, Canadian importers now must have a license to import, have a written preventive control plan, ensure that the food prepared in a foreign country is prepared within the same level of preventative food safety controls as food prepared in Canada, and maintain procedures and processes for handling and investigating complaints and recalls. As we've seen before, importers must provide information prior to the time of import, such as their license number, a description of the food, who they received the food from, and where the food is going to. It is important to know that even when the importer is not required to have a written preventive control plan, the preventive controls themselves must be met. There is also an online tool for industry to help with determining whether or not they have to have a PCP. Like in general terms, PCP or preventive control plan refers to a written document that demonstrates how risks to food and food animals are identified and controlled. The third pillar of SFCR is traceability. The international standard for traceability established by Codex Alimentarius calls for tracking of food commodities forward to the immediate customer and trace materials and food commodities backwards to the immediate supplier, 1 step forward and 1 step backwards. So traceability documents would be requested for recall purposes. And allergen-related issues are one of the top reasons for recalls in Canada, so it's very important to have traceability. It should be mentioned that traceability requirements do not apply to restaurants and similar businesses like snack bars, caterers, etc. This slide is showing preventive control measures for Canadian food businesses who import food. Any Canadian food businesses that import is responsible for safety of the food they import, and they need to take precautions to ensure that the foreign manufacturer is preparing and handling the food in a manner that provides the same level of protection as foods produced in Canada. if, for example, you are a trading company, that you then have to be sourcing food from a manufacturer that has food controls in place. This requires that the food businesses have to know their foods, have to understand the hazards associated with foods they import, and they must source only from the suppliers who have its food safety controls in place, so they have to know their suppliers. Importers are also responsible for ensuring the food they import is handled properly once it arrives in Canada. As you can see on this slide, the importer's preventive control plan must contain the list of hazards associated with the food being imported, documentation showing the foreign supplier is implementing preventive controls to control those hazards. And this includes a description of their hazard-based process and a description of how he or she meeting the regulatory requirements for labeling and packaging. Documents demonstrating that the importer is implementing preventive control plans, or at least controls. For instance, consider the importer sourced out a premium ingredient, but did not understand the risks associated with the product or the production of environment. I'll bring you an example in a second. Like for example, a Canadian company was importing a flavoring preparation to use in their non-dairy frozen dessert. So a consumer with allergy to dairy consumed the product and had an allergic reaction. So the food safety investigation found no cross-contamination at the domestic facility in Canada, and incoming ingredient labels did not indicate any dairy. The incoming ingredients were tested for dairy and found that the flavor preparations had dairy proteins. So the Canadian manufacturer visited the foreign flavor preparation facility and found that they had milk powder in their facility and that they were only blowing out their lines between product runs for their variation of preparations. So they didn't wash them properly. The foreign manufacturer did not have any controls in place to prevent dairy proteins from contaminating other preparations in their facility, as their product was usually used for ice cream, which is made from milk ingredients. So we'll return to this later, to this example. I just want to keep it in your mind for now. So to know you are a reliable supplier, and to be sure if the safety of the food they import from you, Canadian importers may ask you for information about the manufacturing practices and safety controls of the food being exported. It is also helpful to know if your company is a part of your domestic or international food safety certification program, and if your food is subject to this program. This will help a Canadian importer to build their own preventive control plans. So let's now go back to the previous example where the Canadian company was importing a flavoring preparation to use in their non-dairy frozen dessert. Let's look at some options to achieve the safety of their products for this particular situation. So putting production, so the manufacturer had good controls in their own production lines. However, they did not sample the end product, and if they had, they would have found the allergen. And the manufacturer did not specify that the flavoring preparation had to be dairy-free and did not realize the hazards of their product, which is used primarily for dairy-based products. So the foreign manufacturer did not indicate that dairy would be present due to manufacturing conditions. So what could you do to mitigate these risks? So the putting production system or process controls in place, performing sampling of the end product for allergen presence, working with suppliers on ingredient specifications, and carry over precautionary labeling to final products intended to be sold at retail. A lot of this is industry responsibilities. So with regard to minimize the risk of exposure to allergens, food manufacturers, importers, retailers, and food service providers are urged to do the following. Be aware of the priority allergens in Canada. Comply with specific Canadian food safety and allergen labeling regulations to clearly identify the presence of priority allergens. Implement an allergen control program. Ensure the levels of allergens are as low as reasonably possible when there is a high chance of cross-contamination due to processing methods or facility design. Apply precautionary allergen labels where risk actually exists and not as a generic legal disclaimer for all foods. And yes, identifying allergens in important products is especially challenging because the list of priority allergens and the level of regulatory control over food allergen labeling vary from country to country. On site visits of foreign manufacturers, the site visits are most effective way for Canadian importers to determine allergen controls of the food imported into Canada. When doing a site visit, an importer can verify ingredient label, review practices and manufacturing steps, confirm that allergens are properly declared on the final product intended for Canadian consumption, implement periodic testing of final products and ingredients for allergens. Let's bring an example. For example, a food containing surimi. Surimi is a paste that is usually made from fish, and it is commonly used to imitate crab. For example, crab sticks and crab dumplings. If the surimi is made from fish, it is important to ensure the imported imitation crab product clearly declares the presence of fish. This is especially important because fish and shellfish allergies are not the same. So I'm just stressing that importer has to check and work together with an exporter on labeling allergen. The last series of the slides are really about where Canadian importers and foreign exporters entering Canada's food market can look for the proper reference material. One of the biggest ways to reduce the risk of allergen hazards is through compliance promotion. So to help industry and ensuring that they are meeting all regulatory requirements and avoiding risks posed by allergens, gluten, sulfites, the CFIA has created a number of compliance promotions tools, including checklists, model allergen programs for plants that were not required to have written allergen programs in the past, and infographics such as the model ingredient list that we saw earlier. This is the labeling requirements checklist. This checklist goes through all the core elements of a labeling, including list of ingredients, common name, and nutrition fact table. And I think these links are interactive. CFIA has resources with extensive information on preventive controls in general, and they could be found through those links here. For more info, you can also go to our resources that are specific to allergen requirements. Here is an example of a model preventive control plan. So industry can either follow this plan or adapt to suit their own different types of fruit. So remember when we started module 1 today, the first slides were about how important it is for a consumer to know what he or she is eating and how consumers rely on labeling for this knowledge. One of the biggest ways to reduce the risk of allergen hazards is through consumer education. That is why Health Canada and CFIA have resources available, including fact sheets on each of the allergens and their potential sources, as well as online interactive labels to demonstrate that consumers should be looking for. To summarize this presentation, I would like to once again emphasize that undeclared food allergens, gluten, and sulfites represent a health risk and a priority food safety issues in Canada. So the food regulators and regulated parties need to minimize risks associated with inadvertent consumption of undeclared food allergens, gluten source, and added sulfites in food, and to maximize choice of safe and nutritious foods for consumers with dietary restrictions. And this is done through research, testing and surveillance, enhanced regulations, labeling, compliance promotion, industry guidance, inspections, and food safety investigations and recalls. At the end, I give you 2 slides with some interesting facts that relate to allergen regulations and labeling in Canada. You are welcome to read them on your own. And if you would be remembering any of these facts, I would encourage you to remember the last one. Although certain foods are exempt from declaring components, priority food allergens must be declared when present anyway. So thank you very much for your work to listen to these 2 modules. I hope I left you with some systemic picture of Canada's allergen labeling regulations, and that through the provided links, you will be able to find the reference materials. And over to Marie-Pierre now.
Gracias, Natalia. Gracias a los dos.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And thank you to both our presenters today, Michael and Natalia. It has been really interesting and useful. As promised, when we said in the beginning, we have some time for questions. I see we have one question in the chat box. Let me just verify. And you can also use the chat box for any additional questions, and we will do our best to answer. The first question, I think, is probably for Michael. What makes a food be allergic, have an allergen? What difference is there between meat products, grains, vegetables to have an allergic reaction created?
Okay, so that's actually, it's an interesting question. It's a pretty complicated question. I can start by saying that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, all allergens are proteins, or pretty much all allergens. There's a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, it's the protein portion of a food that triggers an allergic reaction in somebody that's allergic. And there's a lot of different proteins in foods, and people can be allergic to almost any kind of food. But what we found is that it's actually a relatively small number of foods that are responsible for most allergic reactions. And that's why we can develop these priority lists where the foods that are most responsible for triggering allergic reactions are the ones that we focus on. The question was sort of, if I'm understanding it correctly, what is it about certain proteins that makes them allergenic and other proteins are not? And again, it's a very complex question, and we don't fully understand that. But we do know that there's certain types of proteins that are more often associated with allergic reactions. For example, there's a family of proteins that are referred to as 2S albumin seed storage proteins. And these are specific proteins that you will find in a lot of different plants, but they are allergenic proteins in a lot of our priority allergens. So for example, those 2S albumin proteins are found in peanuts, as well as a number of different tree nuts, pecans, Brazil nuts, cashew. They're found in mustard and soy. And so in some cases, you can see that these sort of similar proteins that exist in different foods are the ones that are responsible for the allergic reactions. And those are sort of the plant-based ones. There's also ones that are found, for example, in animals. There's something called tropomyosin, which is a muscle protein. And that's one of the primary allergenic proteins that's found in fish, as well as in crustaceans and shellfish. So you can see that there's similarities in some of these proteins that trigger allergic reactions, but it's actually very complicated to kind of look into and know whether a particular protein is going to be allergenic or not. So I'm not sure if I fully answered that question, but I hope I gave a little bit of relevant information there.
Gracias, Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael. So if we don't have any follow-up to that question, I see we have some people with their raised hands. So I'll go ahead and see what they have to ask. And I would also like to tell you that if you have any other questions after today's presentations, I will add my email in the chat box so that you can contact me and I can either help you answer the questions or find someone who will. So after the presentation, you might think of new questions. So just feel free to contact me and we'll gladly answer any questions. So let's go and see. I see Ever Prieto has his raised hand. I think you can open your mic now.
No sé.
Señor Ever Prieto.
Ever Prieto, do you have a question? Or maybe they raised their hand before. So let's check and see. The next one, we have Javier Camaño. If you have a question and you'd like to ask your question, go ahead.
Le acabo de ceder la palabra al señor Federico Valenzuela.
We have Federico Valenzuela, if not.
Tal vez es que las presentaciones fueron tan claras que...
Or maybe the presentations have been very clear, so all questions have been answered. And lastly, to see if Marcela Cangrejo has a question. You have the floor.
Entonces, tal vez yo voy a hacer mi
Well,
oferta
then
de nuevo. Entonces,
I will repeat my offer. If you have any questions afterwards, please feel free to contact me. I will add my email address in the chat box. So if you need anything, if you have questions, let me know. I will either answer myself or find my colleagues to help you. And with that, we can now have the closing remarks. First, I would like to thank you all for participating, and I would like to especially thank our speakers today. It's been a pleasure to share this time with you, and hopefully you have enjoyed the workshop. Before I give the floor back to Jean-Charles to close the workshop, I would also like to say that we have added a link to a survey. You'll find it in the chat box as well. It's always important for us to hear from you. We want to improve our workshops, and if there's anything you feel we can change, you are encouraged to add your comments in this poll. Any suggestions and feedback are most welcome to improve in the future. And thank you to Natalia and Michael again. Thank you also to the interpreters for their great work. And of course, thank you to Aika for organizing today's workshop. Before we close, I also want to thank all participants once again. It has been a very interesting workshop with a complicated or complex topic, and it's a lot of information. So sometimes we understand that we need some time to truly understand everything we've heard, but it has been a very interesting workshop. So thanks everyone for taking the time to share with us today. And again, any feedback you have is welcome, and we are all working towards improving food safety. With that, I give the floor to Jean-Charles.
Fantastic. Un grand merci, Marie-Pierre. Good job, everyone. A sincere thanks on behalf of ICA to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, to Marie-Pierre, to Michael, to Natalia. Great job. For me, a great refresher, and I was very impressed. We had over 100 participants, so you can see there's tremendous interest across the Americas for your expertise, is CFIA's knowledge, how industry can export their product to Canada, how the food system works here. It's been very enjoyable, obviously very beneficial. Just to clarify, even though Marie-Pierre has offered her email and the agency is available to answer and assist you, for those of you, I've seen a lot of questions around the presentation. Now, if you've put that email into the chat box, Gloria, my colleague here in Ottawa, will send you a PDF copy of the slides. The actual webinar itself, the video, will be made available in English and Spanish on our ICA Canada webpage. So if you go to the country page at the ICA website, you can go, there's a video section in each country, and if you go to Canada, you go to video, you can see not only this webinar, but all of our other webinars over the last months, over the last few years. So it's a rich library. And I'm very delighted to be able to add today's webinar to that session. A sincere thanks again to the CFIA, for all the interpreters, to everyone participating and taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. And I wish, stay safe, everybody, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Take good care. Cheers.
Gracias.